The world is a nightmare, but hey, that often pushes me to get stuff done. So after my last Sonic lore compilation, I kinda went back to doing videos informally, no long-term topic, just talking about characters I was thinking about. This compilation will cover all the Sonic videos I did from November 19th to December 31st. We'll just call this period roughly December 2023. Also, because things are happening, might happen, something probably will happen, who's to say what? In addition to posting my short-form content to TikTok, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram like I've been doing, any video under a minute will start being cross-posted on this channel as a short as well. Now, I'm not going to be altering my content to ensure it's under a minute. It wouldn't feel intellectually honest cutting stuff out that I consider key information just to meet a runtime requirement, but if it happens to be under a minute, it'll get posted. Anyway, on with the compilation.
But he was a Jesus allegory once, you know.
So I was tagged in this, so let's unpack it. We actually can't start with the walking on water thing, we have to start a little bit earlier. So, core concepts. The Chaos Force is the all-encompassing energy of the universe. It is also somewhat sentient in that it can choose people to ascend. That does cover the broad strokes for notions of both life and afterlife for several religions. Next figure is Enerjack. Basically, there was an individual who was going to ascend through the Chaos Force, but became corrupted, and they now exist mainly as a spirit that possesses others to do their bidding. This ties into the notions that the devil is a fallen angel of some kind that can't really directly interact with our world, but interacts through influence. Okay, so in Knuckles the Echidna number 8, Knuckles meets his end when Enerjack rips him apart at the molecular level, but is risen from the dead a la A Second Coming the next issue due to the intervention of the Planeswalkers, which are like gods in the Chaos Force. The following issues invoke a lot of biblical imagery, including an Echidna place of worship being a straight-up church. That is a cross! And Knuckles beginning to show borderline divine abilities. This all culminates in Knuckles' faith being tested, where he subsequently learns he can walk on water, where he then uses his abilities to lead his followers to a heavenly promised land. So, largely a combination of different religious stories, mostly focused on Jesus, but with some Moses mixed in. That's not the end though, as Knuckles dies a second time and returns via a third coming, I guess. In this story, Knuckles gives his life to save another, and right around the same time, the floating island is renamed Angel Island, which of course was already its name in the games, but them making the in-story change now while everyone is dressed in white as they receive news of their savior passing is notable. This is followed with the 4-part story Afterlife, which of course features more religious imagery, and where Knuckles ascends to the Chaos Force and communes with the very voice of the universe itself. The mysteries of his life answered before him, before finally returning to the world of the living to help save the planet when he is needed most. Sonic dies this same issue.
I win!
Yeah, a lot is happening here, but Knuckles was very clearly written with some form of religious reading intended. Thanks, Ken! So yesterday, Sega dropped this art, giving us a new official look at Super Eggman. He looks like he's powered by the Phantom Ruby, making it ever less likely that they'll free my mans. But let's go into a brief history of Super Eggman. The first two versions of Super Eggman we saw appeared in the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. The first appeared in the episode Super Robotnik, where he gains Superman-like powers after he is doused in chemicals, letting him outperform Sonic in every way. His only weakness is his caboose, as it's the only part of him that wasn't doused in chemicals. His other super form, Supreme High Robotnik, is tapped into when he obtains 4 Chaos Emeralds, granting him the powers of invincibility, immortality, invisibility, and the power to grant life, as well as turning him giant and making him a reality warper. He was only defeated when Sonic and Tails create time paradox versions of themselves to assist in taking the emeralds from him. The Fleetway comics feature 2 super forms as well. The first occurs in the story Robotnik reigns supreme, where he, after managing to absorb the energy from the Chaos Emeralds, is transformed again into a full-blown gigantic reality warper. And he even manages to create an entirely different timeline where Sonic was never born. The second superform appears in the storyline Game Over, where Robotnik sucks all the energy from Mobius and channels it into himself, essentially turning himself into Darkseid, complete with Omega Beams. The second Sonic movie also features somewhat of a superform with him tapping into the power of the Master Emerald, granting him, again, similar reality warping powers. Doesn't grow giant this time, but he does get a big robot. Close enough. And finally, the most recent mention of a super form for Eggman was in the Sonic Twitter takeover.
Eggman doesn't have a super form.
Hey, don't you speak for me. You know nothing.
So Eggman is crazy strong, and I think people are becoming more and more aware of this, partially due to him throwing different characters around like ragdolls in the IDW comics. But let's try to put some numbers to this. According to the current up-to-date bios on Sonic Channel, Sonic weighs about 35 kilograms, roughly a little over 77 pounds. Eggman weighs about 128 kilograms, a little over 282 pounds. Meaning in this scene in Sonic Lost World, Eggman, one-handed, is supporting roughly 359 pounds, under duress, and then manages to swing Sonic up and over his head. There is no one-to-one real-world equivalent in this situation, but I looked into what I thought was closest. While this feat would be roughly 311 pounds shy of the current world record for one-armed deadlift, it is over 100 pounds more than the current world record for heaviest weighted pull-up. But, you know, most Sonic characters are Olympic-caliber athletes, so this isn't necessarily surprising.
Approximately 2% of my body mass is fat. Allow me to show you what 350 pounds of muscle is capable of.
Well, I'd say the reason a Super Robotnik never really appears in the Archie comics is the fact that Archie's Robotnik has something completely different going on. So in issue 50 of the Archie comics, the first version of Robotnik that's featured in this comic kicks the bucket, and with singular exception, does not come back. And when Robotnik finally does return, with him and Sonic actually coming face to face a little more than 2 years after issue 50, it's revealed to really be Robo-Robotnik, an alternate universe version of Robotnik who completely roboticized himself in order to defeat his world's version of Sonic and the Freedom Fighters, and only came to this reality because he felt a void in his life having no rival. And I do think this is an interesting story choice, because, you know, Sonic does have to win the majority of his encounters with Eggman, and that can kind of reduce how much the reader views Robotnik as a threat. So using a version of Robotnik who has already won once, structurally, I think is pretty smart, and this is the version of the character that sticks around until the soft reboot. Now, he does take on some different forms throughout the time he is roboticized, and I did kind of waffle about whether or not to call these super forms, but they really don't fit the pattern for how Sonic Media treats super forms, and they're really just upgrades. And I'm hesitant to even call them that, because what are you? It's becoming more and more common knowledge that in Archie's Sonic Super Special number 7, Sonic the Hedgehog and company meet Spawn. In reality, he's kind of the least interesting part of this issue because as soon as he meets them, he dips, which I suppose is in character.
Get away from me.
In fact, they actually meet a good handful of the heroes from the Image comics. At least to me, the most notable inclusions here are the Max and Savage Dragon, which I suppose gives Sonic an indirect connection to Invincible. This comic also features parodies of Mulder and Scully from X-Files and yeah, that's just them. There's also cameos from Batman, Spider-Man, and Popeye, for some reason, Imprisoned, which I suppose does track for some appearances those first two have made in certain Image comics. This is a weird little comic, but I also can't say I don't have a good time with it. It's fun. I'd say it's worth checking out. So this is an interesting question. Who is Sonic's favorite superhero? Let's discount visual references to other superheroes, and also alternate universe versions of him that were superheroes. So the times he was Wolverine, Batman, Nightwing, Spider-Man, The Flash, and the Hulk don't factor into his favorite superhero. Instead, let's look at the comics he actually reads. In Sonic the Comic number 177, we get a look at Sonic's room, which remains one of my favorite panels. In this panel, we see he has a Judge Dredd poster, as well as the collected works of Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, and Mike McMahon, who was known for his work on Judge Dredd. So we're starting off with Dredd as a pretty strong contender. On the right, we see he has 3 comic books, issue 66 of Sonic the Comic, Don't Think About It, Hulk 123, and one comic I've been struggling to identify for a while. I know Dr. Doom is centered on the cover, but even with the help of Fantastic Four experts, we've only been able to guess. Now, in the movies, Sonic very much expresses an enjoyment of Batman, but everyone likes at least one piece of Batman media, so that's not special. In the first movie, however, we see him reading Flash comics, specifically issues 285, 277, 273, and 335. Not only reading them out of order, but multiple times, leading me to believe that Sonic does not know how to read comics. But in all these issues, it's Barry Allen Flash. So I'd say that Sonic's top favorites would probably be Barry Allen Flash, probably followed by Judge Dredd. As a bonus, Amy is a known Fantastic Four fan. I bet she started off as a Johnny fan, but slowly became enamored with Sue. While Moebius lacks its own version of Shadow, that doesn't mean the Archie comics didn't feature its own evil version of him. This is King Shadow. In the possible future known as Light Mobius, Robotnik was defeated and Sonic married Sally, becoming King of Mobius. Unfortunately, Sonic accidentally removes himself from the timeline during an accident involving a time machine, which in turn causes Shadow to have to take Sonic's place in the timeline and lead the charge against Robotnik, which causes him to become King of Mobius. Even with Sally attempting to manage his temper, this Shadow's form of leadership is much more authoritarian, as he views controlling the planet as the most effective way of protecting it. He also makes Maria a symbol of worship for Mobius, which, I don't know, might say something about how he handles his trauma. Sonic does manage to return himself to the timeline, and with the help of Knuckles and Knuckles' daughter, Lara Sue, they do manage to defeat and seal away Shadow. He does manage to escape later and unleash Chaos, a mutated fusion of Tikal and Chaos. Don't ask me how that happened, onto Mobius. We don't see him after this, and like a fair amount of later Archie plots, this storyline does go unresolved. Thanks, Ken! I do have mixed feelings about this storyline because it does run counter to the main timeline Shadow's development, but it's also not especially clear when Sonic is removed from the timeline, so for all we know, maybe his first appearance was just Adventure 2 and none of his development happened. So if you remember my Sonic's favorite superhero video, you will remember that I could not identify this book. Well, it's been identified. Major shout out to fellow content creator Do It For Scotty. Definitely check out their stuff. They do a similar style of content to me, so if you like me talking about comics, you'll like them talking about comics. I was kind of on the right track because I thought this sketch I included in that video had something to do with it, but I could only find this trade paperback that used it, and the colors are completely different. Do It For Scotty, however, tracked down this, Jack Kirby Quarterly number 11, which is the exact cover. This was a little-known publication, seemingly released exclusively in the UK according to some sources, by a comic publisher called Pure Imagination, which seemingly specialized in both publishing heroes I've never heard of and reprinting public domain works. It makes sense that this book would be a UK exclusive, cause so was Sonic the Comic. This also brings the grand total of books Sonic owns specifically about Jack Kirby's works to 2, which just means he knows what's up. Again, major shout out to Do It For Scotty. Without them stepping in, this would have been a mystery forever. I think it's really interesting how there is a legitimate argument to view the passing of Maria Robotnik to be the inciting incident for all conflict in the entire Sonic franchise. Obviously, the lasting trauma from the event is the prime focus of 2 of the narratives that focused on Shadow the most, and has at least been indirectly tied to Shadow's character motivations since then. But even on top of that, through the Egg memos, Sonic Frontiers implies that Eggman's turn towards villainy could have been partially influenced by him being neglected in his childhood, which itself was caused by the Robotnik family's communal grief over Maria's passing.
Everyone spoke of her like she was very special. All that love for someone who was gone when I was right there!
What I'm really trying to say is that everything is this guy's fault! He doesn't even get a comeuppance in any of the games. Closest to that is Shadow fighting a version of him that only exists in his memories. And you know what? I don't really care that he's sad about what he did in Sonic X. I want him tried at the Hedgehog! I actually really like how Sonic X handles Maria. In the games, Maria's end is pretty much framed as Shadow's failure to save her. She's seemingly already mortally wounded when she jettisons his escape pod, and in some adaptations, she's already gone by the time that happens. She got fridged. There's no real way of avoiding that. Sonic X, however, reframes it from Shadow's failure to Maria's sacrifice. This time, she's not wounded by the time they get to the escape pod, but they are cornered. She's offered the chance to survive if she just gives up, but she chooses to save Shadow, even at the cost of her own life. And I think that parallels even better against Shadow giving his life to save the planet, even though he did end up surviving that. Then that parallel is brought up again in the latter portion of the anime with Molly, who is given the chance to survive, but can't bring herself to turn away when she feels like she can do something. So yeah, I think Maria is handled very well. The inhibitor rings, sometimes called limiters, are those bracelets that Shadow wears on his wrists. In short, they restrain his power to ensure he doesn't expend too much energy, and the removal of them allows him to gain a massive boost in energy, at the cost of his own stamina. While the rings themselves were first shown in Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic X was the first piece of Sonic media to explain that they actually did something, which would then lead to it being adapted in the games, specifically Sonic 06. While their most recent appearances have been in the Archie comics, at one point point they were planned to be utilized in the IDW comics during the Zombot arc, but it was decided that reintroducing them to the story at that moment would have been too cluttered. There is speculation they'll see some form of use in the Sonic movie because the stand-in prop for Shadow looks like there are parts where the bracelets can be removed, but again, it's just a stand-in prop, mainly used for image reference. Don't get your hopes up. And I will not cover what Tracy Yardley posted! I refuse! So does Amy wear inhibitor rings? This is mainly an in-fandom joke with actually a little bit of canonical basis. In Sonic Battle, after losing a fight, Amy says that she'll be taking their next fight seriously, and proceeds to remove unknown objects from her arms and legs, which make an audible sound when dropping to the ground, with many believing them to be inhibitor rings. However, Cream goes on to ask if she's wearing weights, to which Amy responds that that is indeed what they are. So it's less inhibitor rings and more weighted training clothing like Goku. Because I need everyone to remember that Amy is very strong, even when she was younger, able to easily endure pain that stunned Sonic.
It's my ass-kicking outfit, bitch!
But that's it, right? Amy doesn't wear inhibitor rings. Well, let's timeline this out. Sonic X was the series that established inhibitor rings, but did not begin adapting Sonic Adventure 2's story to the anime until November 2003, and Sonic Battle came out December 2003. In terms of just how game development works, that's not really enough time to factor in elements from Sonic X. However, Sonic X's adaptation of Sonic Battle only released a month after Battle's release, which to me at least proves there was some type of communication between Sonic Team and Sonic X's crew. But with how much the story actually diverges, they very much got the Cliff Notes version. So this is entirely speculation, but I don't think it's impossible that Sonic Team received some vague note about inhibitor rings from Sonic X's crew and just assumed it was weighted training clothing. So I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that Amy wears inhibitor rings. So I didn't expect to have to make an update video about this, but we got a definitive answer about whether or not Amy wears inhibitor rings during the Sonic takeover. And she does not.
Then no, I don't wear those.
I am very curious if the person who asked this saw my video, because what timing. She also establishes that she's been training with Knuckles, and says she could probably split the planet with her hammer, which Tails doesn't believe.
You're telling us one swing and you can just shatter the Earth into little pieces?
She could do it.
And I don't know, Tails, maybe let's not tempt fate when that sort of thing has already happened once. Molly is a character who really only appears in one episode of Sonic X. She's a member of a resistance force from the dying planet Cascade that was decimated by the Metarex. She dreams of one day being able to restore her planet to the way it once was. She also takes an immediate liking to Shadow, likening him to a folk hero called the Black Wind. However, she seems to be the only member of the resistance really dedicated to their cause at this point, as the other members make a deal with the Metarex to capture Dr. Eggman, and in exchange would be allowed to join the Metarex's forces, essentially forsaking their entire planet. The episode purposefully parallels Molly not only to Maria, but to Shadow, Rouge noting their character similarities. In the end, despite Shadow's attempts to make her flee from the battle, she returns to fight and ends up being destroyed by the Metarex, leading an enraged Shadow to take out the entire battalion of them. The English dub alters this in a pretty major way, rewriting dialogue and recutting the footage to imply that Molly did in fact run away and live, kind of undermining the entire emotional weight of the episode. One of the final shots of Sonic X is Shadow standing over Molly's gravesite, but the planet no longer appearing desolate, now lush with green, implying that Molly's dream was accomplished posthumously. You're conflating a handful of different things. That's fine, the Archie comics are weird. I'll explain though. This is the Ring of Acorns, a mystic relic created by the scientist Nate Morgan, and the power of this ring was so potent it had the ability to grant wishes. Fast forward to Archie's Sonic Adventure adaptation, and the Freedom Fighters discover the lost city of the Ancients, which turns out to be Station Square.
Oh yeah!
Amy asks to tag along as she always gets left out of adventures, and the Freedom Fighters tell her no as she's too young, to which she responds that her and Tails are the same age, so that's not really fair. And yeah, I agree with that. They still tell her no, though. This leads Amy to make a wish on the Ring of Acorns to be older, and while she is wearing her bracelets after she makes her wish, we can also see the Ring of Acorns on the ground in the background. Her bracelets and the Ring of Acorns are two separate things. In fact, they even forget to color her bracelets in on the next page. So yeah, that design bit is in no way intentional. The behind the scenes reason for this pretty unhinged moment makes it much more mundane. Around this time, Sega was not great about communicating to their licensees, so when the team at Archie had to adapt Sonic Adventure and saw that Amy, who they had been writing as a small child, had been aged up a notable amount, this was the best they could come up with on short notice. Funnily enough, the Fleetway comics completely skirted around this weirdness by virtue of the fact that they always treated Amy as roughly the same age as the rest of the cast. They just had to change her haircut. It's always a special thing when a series manages to transcend cultural boundaries. Sonic is definitely one of those series. And another is detective drama Columbo, which grew incredibly popular in Japan to the point that there are two separate properties that draw heavy influence from it, those being Furuhata Ninzaburo, which often gets referred to as the Japanese version of Columbo, and Shinano no Columbo, which unsurprisingly translates to Columbo of Shinano. Funnily enough, in the 39th episode of Sonic X, Vector directly references Columbo. Surprisingly, this reference is actually preserved in the English dub, but references a different Columbo line.
一つ聞いてもいいですかあれもこっちのテレビか
刑事シリーズ。
いやー、うちの神さんがねいつまでやっているつもりだ、ベクター
That's very interesting.
Here he goes again.
Oh, brother.
One more thing.
How long are you gonna keep this up anyway?
Now what should you take from this information? That Columbo is pretty good. You should probably go watch it. While Shadow was absent from the Sonic Takeover, Tails did read us an absentee message he left.
It says, if anyone asks, my favorite flower is Lantanas.
What?
Everyone picked up immediately that this is a reference to the many memes about Shadow loving Latinas, while also, as far as I'm concerned, calling back to Tails constantly misreading usernames on other takeovers. But on top of that, I think it's also referencing an even more obscure piece of Shadow lore. In the game LEGO Dimensions, amidst the Sonic level pack, Shadow offers you a side quest where you help him take up the hobby of flower arrangement, as he explores the many potential ways to fulfill Maria's final wish. This could be a complete coincidence, but I like to think it's intentional. Makes the joke more layered at least. Shadow isn't the only alien hedgehog. Let's talk about Turbo the Alien.
I could have been Turbo?
In issue 161 of the Fleetway comics, Sonic and Amy are abducted by aliens who force Sonic to serve as their representative in a race against a different group of aliens, threatening Amy's life if he refuses or loses. He then meets who he is racing against, an alien being named Turbo who just happens to resemble him. He's also being forced to race as the lives of his family are being threatened. Sonic ends up losing the race, not being used to racing in zero gravity, but Amy manages to free herself, only then to find out that the loser's ship would be destroyed as well. Sonic convinces Turbo to stand up to his masters and save Amy, and that's his only appearance in the main comic.
I could have been Turbo!
So yesterday, the fan film Project Shadow came out, and I really loved it. This really set the bar high for what I'm expecting from the third Sonic movie. The project was primarily helmed by one person, Joao Felipe Santiago, and I really hope this either gets them work in the industry or just the funding to pursue their original projects, because there is an amazing technical proficiency on display. I also would be more than happy for them to helm a Shadow spin-off if that's something we get from the movies. This is an amazing heartfelt retelling of Shadow's origin story that's definitely worth watching. Even with the story it's adapting being incredibly well known to me, it still carries the emotional weight it needs, to the point that even though I'm certain the vast majority of my viewers know the story by heart, I'm hesitant to discuss anything about it because I think it needs to be experienced firsthand. It's only a little under a half hour, go check it out. So Sonic's siblings, Manic and Sonia, have pretty much remained exclusively in Sonic Underground, but with a handful of exceptions. They see a pretty substantial appearance in Sonic Super Special number 10, with Sonic and Scourge both visiting their reality. As an unconfirmed cameo, characters resembling both of them show up in a crowd shot in issue 134 of the main comic. That issue features tons of cameos from characters outside of Archie's continuity, so it wouldn't surprise me if it is them. In issue 144, there's a flyer on the ground indicating that they visited this reality as part of an interdimensional tour. Sonic and Sally's potential future children are also named after them. They were supposed to have a substantial appearance in Sonic Universe number 50, which would have served as an epilogue to the cartoon, which was even advertised in Sonic Super Special Magazine number 5, but for one reason or another it was cancelled and replaced with a Metal Sonic story. Funnily enough, the same page of the magazine advertises an adaptation of Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, when the racing game that preceded that one, Sonic and Sega All-Star Racing, featured an unintentional cameo from Sonia after fan art of her got mistakenly used as part of an art asset. Scratch and Grounder actually have much more connections outside their debut cartoon than Manic and Sonia. Both of them appear in Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, and Scratch appears in Sonic Spinball. Both appear as early as the second issue of Archie Sonic, starting off working for Robotnik, before beginning to work at Mammoth Mogul's Casino with Scratch as the concierge and Grounder as the cook, along with the other adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog character Coconuts. They appear post-reboot as well, both in flashback and shown to still be working at a casino, this time for Breezie the Hedgehog. Finally, they do make a cameo on a variant cover for IDW Sonic number 40, both of them in Eggman's live chat, Scratch even typing out his trademark laugh. We actually got a pretty definitive answer to this in the Sonic Encyclopedia. If you turn to the section about Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, the text does state that Scratch is loosely based on the clucker Badnik. However, in my research I also found claims that this same Badnik may have inspired Cluck, Robotnik's beloved pet, who first appeared in Sat AM. Coincidentally, much like Scratch, Cluck also appears in Sonic Spinball. But the Encyclopedia neglects to mention him, unless you count the mention of Sat AM characters appearing in the game. Cluck disappears from Sat AM once Season 2 starts, which I always felt was because he was a leftover from the Pitch Bible, when Robotnik had a foil and parallel in a character who would work with the Freedom Fighters, but that's probably a story for another day. So Sally and the Freedom Fighters don't have a lot of appearances outside of Sat AM and Archie, but there's still a few. Sally, Bunny, Rotor, and weirdest of all, Sonic's dog Mutsky all appear in a bonus stage of Sonic Spinball, which is the largest case of Antoine erasure I've ever seen. Sally appears in the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog Christmas special, though she has no dialogue. Dialogue was apparently scripted for her, but was cut prior to animation beginning, with some sources saying that the reason for this was that her voice actress, Katsusi, was busy recording dialogue as Lola Bunny for Space Jam at the time, and Tabitha St. Germain filled in the non-verbal noises that Sally makes in this special. There is a Fleetway version of Sally, but I'm hesitant to call that a cameo, as this version of the character was sourced from the book Stay Sonic, which itself is based off of the Sonic Bible. Finally, both Sally and Bunny make cameos in the third issue of the Sonic Forces prequel comic, as pictures hung in the background in Rouge's office. Now, will we ever see an actual full return for them?
Maybe someday.
But I doubt anytime soon. So I got this comment that Scratch and Grounder have a cameo in the Tangle and Whisper miniseries, which I didn't know, and I also have never seen anyone else mention. I've already talked about how they have a cameo on a variant cover for issue 50. But this piqued my curiosity, so because I'm the way I am, I decided I was going to comb through all of the Tangle and Whisper miniseries until I found it. And here they are in issue 2. Obviously those aren't exactly their designs, but it's undoubtedly a reference to them. And I could see them looking something like this if they showed up in the comic properly. Good catch. Eclipse the Darkling is Shadow the Hedgehog's brother. First appearing in the Sonic Universe arc Shadowfall, he was created sometime after the events of the game Shadow the Hedgehog with the express purpose of destroying Shadow. However, much like Shadow, he is not fully subservient to the hive mind of the Black Arms, and decides that it would be better for the Black Arms to attempt to sway Shadow back to their side, even if it ends up being through mind control. The plan backfires as the rest of Team Dark are able to break Shadow free of the mind control, and Shadow proceeds to destroy the rest of the Black Arms forces, leaving Eclipse and the next generation of the Black Arms, the Dark Arms, the only surviving members of their species. After crash landing on Angel Island, Eclipse plans to steal the Master Emerald in order to gain an energy source that will both ensure the survival of the newborns and ensure his revenge. And Knuckles is eventually forced to shatter the emerald to prevent Eclipse from getting his hands on it. Being created specifically to counter Shadow, he does have some interesting abilities, such as being able to block Shadow from using his Chaos abilities, and being able to transform into a stronger form at will, as well as several other specialized forms with the assistance of the Dark Arms. Eclipse is also listed among Ian Flynn's favorite characters on his website, being that he was created for the comics by Ian Flynn in the post-reboot timeline. I don't think it's impossible for him to be reintroduced to the series at some point, however slim the chances of that may be. So yes, Sonic did have a dog. Sonic's dog Mutsky first appeared in the pilot episode of Sat AM in a roboticized form before making a handful of appearances in the Archie comics. After Sonic gained an implant that allowed him to understand alien languages, he started being able to directly communicate with Mutsky, being able to completely understand his barks. While Mutsky is just a dog in the pre-reboot timeline, in the post-reboot timeline he's turned into a regular Mobian and is the apprentice to Uncle Chuck, a fact that Sonic and Tails react appropriately to. Santa Claus iconography is used quite a lot in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, with even the design of Sonic's shoes being partially inspired by Santa. But does Santa Claus exist in-universe? In the special Sonic Christmas Blast, Santa Claus is treated as a public figure, and Sonic directly interacts with him, so that's 1 point for yes. In the Fleetway comics, Father Christmas does in fact exist. He's initially treated very similar to the ghosts past, present, and future from A Christmas Carol, visiting Robotnik in a ghostly form in an effort to both get him to change his ways and foil his current scheme. He has more typical appearances later in the comic, but I really like the way they initially depict him. Either way, point for yes. In issue 15 of Archie's Sonic X comic, Sonic is a non-believer in Santa Claus, believing that it sounds so unbelievable that it has to be one of Eggman's schemes. He even runs all the way to the North Pole in an attempt to locate the workshop. The comic refrains from giving a 100% affirmative answer, with it not really being clear if Sonic buys into the whole Santa Claus thing at the end, but with him saying that we all should believe in something. Let's put a point in maybe. Finally, Santa Claus appears as a background cameo in Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympic Games. There's no direct interaction with him, but he's pretty definitively there. So I'd say that's a point in yes. With 3 yeses and 1 maybe, I'm gonna go with probably. Okay, so Robotnik has actually been given a couple of origins. That origin involving the rotten egg was first established in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise Bible, and was subsequently utilized in both the 1991 promotional comic and the Fleetway comics. In short, the kindly Dr. Kintober, a close friend of Sonic the Hedgehog, was corrupted by the power of the Chaos Emeralds and a rotten egg, which transformed him into the monstrously evil Dr. Robotnik. Fleetway plays this origin up as the idea of Sonic being forced to fight someone who was once his friend does have a layer of tragedy to it. Sat AM and Archie depict Robotnik as always having been kind of a bad dude, having long conspired to take over the planet in some form. He eventually had to flee from his original home with the Overlanders after it was discovered he was testing his war machines on living people, where he subsequently found himself in the kingdom of Acorn and became their warlord, helping them win the war against the Overlanders before staging his own coup to take over the kingdom. The 1991 book Sonic the Hedgehog by Michael Teitelbaum is meant to follow the Sat AM and Archie canons, but does its own thing when it wants to. For instance, making Sonic and Robotnik foster brothers, with Robotnik only being 8 years older than Sonic. Which is weird, I don't like that. The games are much more vague with his backstory, with the majority of information being how he idolized his grandfather and Maria's passing making him grow jealous. The Japanese manual of the first game seems to indicate that he and Sonic had met prior to the events of that game, but the robots seem new. Really, in the end, take your pick at your preference. So who is Shard the Metal Sonic? Our story begins in issues 86 and 87 of the Archie comics in a storyline that takes light inspiration from the Sonic OVA, with a Metal Sonic making a selfless sacrifice and proceeding to get covered in lava. Many issues later, his encased remains were discovered and then delivered to Sonic's Uncle Chuck, who began to rebuild him using parts from other defeated Metal Sonics. After being completed, Shard would join the Secret Freedom Fighters, an undercover team tasked with undermining the rule of the villainous Naugus. His first meeting with Sonic and friends was a bit tumultuous, as they first believed him to have been rebuilt by Eggman, and even after they started working together, Sonic remained distrustful, as Shard could not spill the details of his origin. Despite all this, the two do manage to part on good terms. Shard's final appearance occurred in Sonic Universe 50, possibly meeting his end at the hands of another Metal Sonic, though we never found out his true fate as the Genesis wave struck an issue later, effectively soft rebooting the continuity. But even then, in a 2022 episode of writer Ian Flynn's podcast, he stated that the Archie team wasn't really sure if this was going to be the true end to Shard. Shard, like Eclipse, is listed as one of Ian Flynn's favorite characters, but while Ken Penders makes no claim of ownership of Shard, as even those two initial issues I mentioned were written by Spider-Man editor Danny Fingeroth, it's much less likely for him to be reintroduced because there's a lot of continuity needed to lead up to him, but you know, nothing's impossible. Infinite the Jackal is the main antagonist in Sonic Forces. Once the leader of a team of mercenaries known as the Jackal Squad intent on taking down Eggman and collecting the bounty, Infinite's plans changed after making contact with the Phantom Ruby, and subsequently having a vision, deciding to join with Eggman. However, after a run-in with Shadow the Hedgehog, who destroyed his entire squad and told Infinite he was too weak to bother destroying, Infinite allowed Eggman to modify him with the Phantom Ruby, granting him reality warping powers. His first target was E123 Omega before setting his sights on Shadow, trapping him in a virtual reality. He also made short work of Sonic upon their first meeting as well, though later Sonic and friends did manage to defeat him, leading him to be consumed by the Phantom Ruby. Since then, Infinite's made appearances in mobile games and smaller side stories, but nothing in terms of mainline appearances or comic appearances, which is a shame as I do think he's a character with tons of potential writing-wise. Speaking of which, y'all should play Sonic Forces Overclocked. So every time I bring up the Sonic Bible, I get comments like this, and that's fair. The Sonic franchise has an interesting history when it comes to religion, both in and out of official media. But this is not that. A series Bible or pitch Bible is quite possibly the normalest thing for a franchise to have. Your favorite series probably has one. It's mainly to just effectively communicate how a series should be. Sonic's gets more attention than these other pitch Bibles because both how widely available it is and how different it is to what the franchise is today. So there's 3, actually, an early undated 13-page draft that's just a story treatment, a second 16-page draft, and a third 41-page draft. Funnily enough, Sally Acorn, as well as Fleetway characters Johnny Lightfoot and Porker Lewis were first mentioned in the third draft, with them only being referred to as Rabbit, Squirrel, and Pig in the second draft. There is actually a 4th Sonic Bible, specifically for Sonic SatAM, and that's hosted over on the Sonic SatAM fan site, but that's a whole different thing. Let's talk about Breezie the Hedgehog. Breezie originally appeared in The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog in the episode Lovesick Sonic as a creation of Dr. Robotnik meant to distract Sonic from foiling his plans. Breezie does eventually betray Robotnik, and in a later episode, she does get together with another one of Robotnik's traitorous creations, Robotnik Jr. She then appears again in the post-reboot Archie timeline. Her backstory initially appears very similar to that of Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, with her working with Eggman against Sonic. However, some dialogue, like her stating she's working with the doctor to not worry about where her next meal is coming from, as well as an image of her during childhood, seems to imply that she's not a robot this time around, though Ian Flynn stated that even that was probably a lie, so she may still be a robot in some form. When we catch up with her in present day, it's found she's running a large casino as well as a fighting tournament where the grand prize is a Chaos Emerald, in an arc that's a loose adaptation of Sonic the Fighters, though she very clearly has not changed her ways, as she is shown teaming with Neo Metal Sonic in a flashback. There were apparently larger plans for her, but they were cut short when Archie lost the license to Sonic. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the videos I do, consider supporting me over at patreon.com/hsquid. And shout out to my current patron, Ned Rex. See y'all in the next video.